What's going on, guys? We're here at San Diego State University. It's June 27th, and we're here with a few student leaders. So can you guys go ahead and state your names and things you might be doing here on campus?
Of course. My name is Tajuddin Henry. I'm a third-year African-American Studies and Public Health major. I currently serve as the Executive Vice President of our Associated Student Government, and I'm also a brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated by way of the Eta Sigma chapter.
And I just need to add there, let's talk for a second about the connection between alphas and student government. We have same positions, so that's exciting. I was very happy when I found out he was VP as well.
My name's Derrick Herrera. I'm a first-year master's student at San Diego State studying political science. I have degrees in political science, international security, and American Indian studies, and I currently serve as the Associated Students Vice President of External Relations this year.
Awesome. So with our project being a coast-to-coast initiative, raising awareness for 18 to 25-year-old voters, all of us here at this table are in that demographic. And so I'm curious for you guys, are you registered to vote?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, and so I'm assuming you voted before, but how are you guys feeling about the upcoming election and, going and putting your vote in and everything surrounding that?
I feel like this year is very difficult because we're in the same position that we were. I don't know if any of you voted in 2020, but that was my first time voting. I just turned 18, and it was almost an obvious choice for me for who I wanted in office, but with the same candidates at the table again, I'm conflicted, and I hear that's a common thing throughout all campuses.
This will be my first time voting in a presidential election. I'm 19 years old. I voted locally before, but obviously the presidential election has a great deal of impact. I, like many others, feel like I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place between two presidential candidates who don't value our community or the American people at large or the injustices that are going on geopolitically right now. But I do know that I much prefer a presidential candidate who doesn't have 30-plus felonies.
Yeah.
I might not love Joe Biden, but I know Trump hates us way more. I'm still conflicted, but I think it's a easy choice to make between two hard picks.
And you both mentioned sort of this idea of there being conflict and who to vote for. Does that make you have some sort of, I want to say, lack of hope in the American democracy in general? Or do you still have hope in what America is or can be in representing our viewpoints and our beliefs as 18 to 25-year-olds?
I think what's going on in the world in the context of socio-political politics, especially what's happening along the West Bank, especially in Gaza, our reaction to it in the United States says a lot about what's happening in government, specifically what's happening on the Hill. Unfortunately, I identify as very Democratic, and I felt comfortable voting for Joe Biden, but I feel like this past year has been so, for lack of better words, lame. I have seen nothing done for people of color, let alone a multitude of our communities, especially when people are in need. And if just seeing the same two candidates again, I feel like I come to a position where I don't expect anything to happen the next 4 years with either of them. I feel like if anything, it's going to become more stringent, or it's going to be a full lame duck year, and it'll only show that we need change in political positions. We need change the House, the Senate, and presidential candidates. And often when we say that, we get retaliation that our younger generations don't really know what they're talking about, let alone people of color in power positions. They often say that they're too radical, they're too extremist, and they don't deserve these positions. But in reality, it's about time.
Yeah. And so one thing we've heard a lot on our trip is, the presidential election is one thing, but it's also very important to vote on the lower levels, municipal levels, and things like that. And so with our generation hearing so many things on social media about just the two presidential candidates, I feel like people don't always understand that there's so much more to it and that your vote matters in so many different ways. And so how would you guys, what advice would you give, and how would you encourage young voters to go out and vote for the things that might affect their lives more on a day-to-day basis?
I think it's very important for men and women our age to become educated on what being a political constituent consists of. So what our impact is on a local level, what ability we have to reach out to our local politicians, assembly members, and the people who are supposed to represent us that we can't reach. We're allowed to call them. So I think much more local voter education will go a long way as far as combating a lot of the injustices we feel on a local level, having to do with different police departments, access to education, the different ways districts are set up, not only for voting, but like I said, education, like the distribution of access to health care. Those are all things that we can influence at a local level. And I don't think that there are many programs on a collegiate or locally that help educate people our age.
Well, for one, how do you guys stay educated? And what advice would you have for your peers on staying up to date on a lot of the policies that you're voting on ballot day?
I feel like that's such an important question, especially now in these days when social media is a huge political platform right now, especially Instagram, where you will literally run into the most crazy things that are being said on the social platforms, and you don't know what to believe or what is like nonpartisan or what falls align with your morale. I feel like for me, the best thing that I've been doing is engaging with the staffers in those specific political offices that I'm interested in. Although like I have privilege in this position and I kind of have some easy access locally, but before being in this position and beforehand, coming out of high school, I realized that the local political offices, let alone the state, are so accessible, and to me they seem so intimidating, mostly because these spaces aren't constructed around hearing feedback or cultivating policies around constituency. It's mostly a platform that a political candidate comes in and they're running on and they want to complete. But doing the outreach and saying that these are my concerns, as well as kind of doing almost like a call to action, has helped me understand the capacity of what's possible and gain more information. But aside from that, I feel like really doing your research into news outlets, like I think the best one that I've ran into is Associated Press. And that's not to say to engage in partisan news outlets. It's great to do that, but it's also great to know which ones are catering to you and which ones will deliver the information that you want to hear, bias and unbiased.
I'm curious, so both of you are student leaders. And so obviously it's very divisive in DC. I know at UNC Chapel Hill, this has probably been one of my hardest years to be a student leader. I mean, the protesting that's happened for justice in Palestine, we had battalions of police officers on campus, gates put up in different areas. How is it here at San Diego State University? And it's a beautiful campus, by the way. Amazing.
And DEI issues as well, because that's impacted our campus in a pretty heavy way.
Yeah.
I'd like to start just before I segue to Derrick. He was present and actually spoke at one of the protests, so I'll share my limited experience with those issues, and then he can offer a much more detailed response. As far as the protesting having to do with the Palestinian genocide, it was much more peaceful here than in neighboring universities. Our chapter is chartered at UCSD as well, and the protests there were much more violent. It was treated more as an insurrection than a peaceful protest. Students were jailed and physically assaulted. They were barred from entering certain locations on campus. There's funds being organized to bail them or allow some students who are graduating to cross the stage or receive their diploma based off their political action. But here it was much more controlled in the sense that there was a police presence, but not in order to prevent us from protesting. We actually had a peaceful protest outside in the Union downstairs, led by several student organizations, such as Students for Justice in Palestine, as well as the Native American Student Association, Black Resource Center, and Black student leaders were present. It was very meaningful, and it was actually one of the catalysts that helped us pass a resolution for a ceasefire at our university, which we were one of the first few California State University schools to do. And I think the response that we faced as a community in protesting kind of also relates to how DEI campus issues are looked at by the administration. Like, it's something that we very much have to fight to have be seen, but have proven meaningful to the student body and student admin only when our voices are unified as one.
And if I can, before we jump to you, do you feel administrators are listening to, like, for example, protests like that? Do you think they're, like, ignoring it, or are they actually sitting down and actively figuring out how to make at least the campus climate one that's sustainable for everyone?
I think in our positions we have a unique privilege to access the ears of administrators, but as a general member of the student body, that administration can feel alienating at times. I can't speak on their personal views on one of the many conflicts that's going on worldwide right now, especially having to do with the Palestinian genocide. But I know that the biggest issue for students is access. I can't speak on whether they care or not, but it can be very difficult to feel heard or understood or have our concerns cared for.
Yeah. This is a loaded question, and I feel like it's hard to not acknowledge the context of the hate that's been happening on campus prior to the crisis along the West Bank. For example, I don't remember exactly when, but it was fairly recent, I would say within the last 6 years.
The doxing thing?
Yeah.
2017.
A bunch of students from the Muslim community were getting doxxed with public information, with their public information being spread around campus to just students who were acting in malice and would do whatever they would want with that information. But also, a hijabi woman who was Muslim had her hijab ripped off one day on campus.
Wow.
So we do have history of Islamophobia on our campus, and it's hard to ignore that when we kind of reflect on what's happened this past year and the call to action that the students have been making upon our administrators, let alone our campus, that there's a consistent issue going on. And a lot of the administrators, in my opinion, as far as I've heard and seen firsthand, think they say it's great, but it's almost like they're looking over the students. Like, quite literally, they'll sit in their offices or a spot that's blind and be watching the protest, and they'll say they loved it. They think the students did great, but there's no further conversations about it. They just let it happen and don't want to take a side. But for context, I think late October, when October 7th had occurred, our university president decided to send out an email, an agency, which was geared more very Zionist coded and a little bit Islamophobic, and it sprawled such an uproar. It was ridiculous, and how she didn't consult almost anybody, especially people within her cabinet who were telling her not to do it and not send it out, but she decided to do it anyway. And it goes to show that shared governance in that capacity of the university itself is failing the students right now. But in terms of our student government and being leaders in this peak time, not only during the presidential election, but during times of crises, we've had the privilege to be able to support our students in calling for a ceasefire and asking the university to do the same. And I know this coming fall we'll probably see something regarding divestment. And we're so privileged to be able to offer the students the platform to do that.
Just to quickly piggyback off what Derrick was discussing, I think that because of the amount of student activism that's gone on, it's allowed for university administration to be unintentionally complicit with Zionist sentiments, as far as allowing themselves to be silent on speaking on the Islamophobia that students have faced. Even in the peaceful protests that I mentioned earlier, there were groups of Zionist students waiting, watching the protests, taking pictures of people in order to later on dox them or, publish that information for, nefarious purposes. And I think that a lot of university administration feels that they don't need to address the student body in a meaningful manner on a one-on-one level, especially the student affairs and campus diversity portion of admin. And that's all.
And I guess with that, it's just I'm curious because this goes back to what we've been hearing from a lot of different students and a lot of different college age students specifically about like adults aren't listening, Congress isn't listening, President isn't listening. How do you employ what strategies are there even that exist that make these individuals move and hear us? Like what can be done so that we're heard? And obviously, someone says vote, but people vote and they don't see results. How do you sort of bring that to light to get people excited about engaging in the democratic process and understanding that, hey, like we're actually going to get something done?
I think I would say it's a hard question, but I think it's a good opportunity to capitalize on the fact that voting isn't the only way that you could have your voice heard, let alone make change. Throughout the year so far with my team, I've been talking about the privilege that exists in voting throughout history of the United States. And also to today, there are people who still can't vote. For example, in San Diego, we cater to one of the largest undocumented populations. Mm-hmm. And often when we kind of gauge our initiatives to encourage people to vote, it totally misses a whole portion of our community that we're trying to cater to, and it puts them to be outcasted. But when you're putting the optic of participating in the democratic process, it's important to include everybody and all voices in these spaces, and it's not impossible to switch the conversation from voting to what you could actually do and making things seem feasible. For example, although undocumented folks can't vote, whether they have a pending status or they're struggling to start their process, that does not mean they don't have access to their representatives that are in their area. These people are still constituents. These people are still residents of San Diego, and they deserve a seat at the table as much as anybody else. So I think starting from the ground level locally, whether it's your county, your city, or the state, just using the power of your voice and your opinion could change everything. I know for myself as a Native and Indigenous person, a lot of people don't often hear our perspectives or voices at San Diego State. And once I started bringing my optic to the table, a lot of things started to change and a lot of progression started to happen. But if I didn't make the step to getting out there, I fear that I genuinely wouldn't know when something like that would occur. And I feel like often the fear of these elected leaders being so out of touch or out of reach creates this stereotype of just being silent and complicit. But during a time of agency and during a time of crisis right now where we need action, we need things to happen, whether it's what's happening in the world in terms of humanitarian crisis or issues that are happening within our confines, just knocking on the door is the first step you can make to creating tangible change. Although I hate doing it because I feel like they talk about so much political jargon or follow the bureaucratic process. But being real and being your authentic self truly shows these people that they need to remember that they can't be out of touch because they're elected officials. They're meant to be held accountable, and they're human. I think often when elected officials are in office for so long, they truly forget who they're serving and why they're in that position in the first place. For example, I know in the city of San Diego, we have our mayor, Todd Gloria, who was elected into this position, and he ran out a lot of platforms that were very performative. And for example, one of his platforms was helping our unhoused population. And recently, a city ordinance was passed to criminalize unhoused people living on the streets in the county of San Diego, which is very contradictory. So just starting from your local legislative offices could really make the impact.
And to kind of shift the conversation, one word that's continuously come up along our journey is the word hope. And so how do you guys view that word? What does that word mean to you, and how do you see it taking place here in San Diego and on your campus? I know the protests can kind of give off a sign of hope for the younger generations, but what does that word mean to you, and how are you seeing it take place here?
I think what Hope has represented and meant to not only myself but the student population has just been the opportunity to make meaningful change. Hope isn't like a shot in the dark or wishing on a star, but the potential in us as students and as human beings at no matter what age or academic year we stand to be able to influence the political landscape that surrounds us, and the potential for that change and also the action that we take towards creating it is what Hope, I think, has represented not only in our journey as student leaders, but in our journey as human beings developing at this academic institution.
I think hope, I've heard that too, and I can't disagree that I have hope for the future in terms of what I'll see maybe when I come around to the age of 35 and see people in my generation running for office and making change in Capitol Hill. But I think there are some people who use hope as an excuse to kind of forget what's happening right now. That the government is in huge gridlock, and that all we could do is hope for the future and that it changes and it doesn't get worse. But I think the large portion of hope is that with the uproar and the impact that students are having across the nation and across the world through protest, utilizing their voice and getting retaliation because they're not protected by academic freedom goes to show that people aren't scared, and that in the future people will actually make tangible change without worrying about things like money, budget, and things like political action committees. Maybe in the future we won't need that, and I hope that is our future, that we have actual change and that we have people who aren't afraid of upsetting somebody else.
Wow. I thank you both so much for sitting with us today and providing your insights. I think we could have a part 2 just on talking about hope. Honestly, I want to. We may need to have another video on that, but really appreciate you inviting us into your amazing school and having a conversation with us. These are 2 amazing student leaders, and we thank you for your time so much.
It was lovely joining you all today. We appreciate the questions.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us.